The 5 Yogas. Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti Yoga is the yoga of the religious way. Bhakti Yoga teaches how to believe, how to pray, and how to attain certain salvation. Bhakti Yoga can be applied to any religion, as differences in religions do not exist for Bhakti Yoga. There is only the idea of the religious way. The yogi Ramakrishna, who in the 1880s lived at the monastery of Dakshineswar near Calcutta, became known through the works of his disciples, Vivekananda, Abhedananda, and others. He was a bhakti yogi and recognized as equal all religions with all their dogmas, sacraments, and rituals. He himself belonged simultaneously to all religions. 12 years of his life were spent in following over and over again the way of asceticism, according to the rules of each of the great religions in turn. Always he came to the same result, to the state of samadhi or ecstasy, which he became convinced constitutes the aim of any religion. Ramakrishna used therefore to say to his disciples, that from personal experience he had arrived at the conclusion that all great religions are one. He was convinced that all of them lead alike to God, that is to hidden knowledge. In bringing humanity nearer to samadhi, Bhakti Yoga, if practiced separately from other yogas, carries us away completely from the world. One acquires enormous powers, but at the same time loses the capacity for using them, as well as the capacity for using their ordinary powers for earthly purposes. Ramakrishna told his disciples that after he had been several times in the same state of samadhi, he began to feel that he was no longer able to take care of himself. He told his disciples how once he cried, thinking that now he must die of starvation. This frightened him at first, until he became convinced that somebody was always taking care of him. In the book, The Gospel of Ramakrishna, published by the Vedanta Society, New York in 1907, on page 419, a remarkable conversation is quoted between the sick Ramakrishna, who was already approaching death, and an Indian sage, a Pandit, who came to visit him. Pandit Sashadhar came one day to pay his respects to Bhagavan Ramakrishna. Seeing his illness he asked, "Bhagavan, why dost thou not concentrate thy mind upon the diseased part, and thus cure thyself?" The Bhagavan replied, "How can I fix my mind, which I have given to God upon this cage of flesh and blood?" Sashadhar said, "Why dost thou not pray to thy divine mother for cure of thy illness?" The Bhagavan answered, "When I think of my mother, the physical body vanishes and I am entirely out of it, so it is impossible for me to pray for anything concerning the body. Thus, all that man attains on this path has no value from the earthly perspective, and cannot be used for the acquisition of earthly comforts. The impossibility of proving by argument to another the existence of what they do not themselves feel emotionally, caused Ramakrishna to teach that Bhakti Yoga is the best of all ways of yoga, because it does not require proof. Bhakti Yoga addresses itself directly to the feelings, and brings together not people who think alike, but people who feel alike. Ramakrishna also considered Bhakti Yoga the simplest, and the easiest of all ways, because this way demands the destruction of all attachments to anything earthly, self-renunciation, the giving up of one's will, and the unconditional surrender of oneself to God. However, since for many people precisely this may seem to be the most difficult, that alone shows that Bhakti Yoga is a way for people of a certain definite type, and of a definite mentality. That Bhakti Yoga cannot be considered a way accessible to all. Bhakti Yoga has much in common with Raja Yoga, as like Raja Yoga, Bhakti Yoga includes methods of concentration, meditation, and contemplation. However, the object of concentration, meditation, and contemplation is not the I, but God, that is the all, in which that little spark of human consciousness completely vanishes. The practical significance of Bhakti Yoga lies in emotional training. Bhakti Yoga is a method of breaking in and harnessing emotions for those whose emotions are particularly strong, but whose religious emotions, that ought to control other emotions, are scattered, not concentrated, and carry them at once very far, but produce strong reactions. At the same time, it is a method for developing religious emotions for those in whom they are weak. Bhakti Yoga is in a sense supplemental to any religion, or an introduction to religion for one of a non-religious type. The ideas of Bhakti Yoga are nearer and more intelligible for the West than the ideas of other yogas, owing to the existence in Western literature of works on religious practice akin to Bhakti Yoga in their spirit and meaning, although quite different in quality. Works of this type can be found in Protestant countries, for instance the books of German mystics of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. However, Protestantism cut itself off too thoroughly from tradition, and the authors of these works were obliged to seek either openly or stealthily for support of their methods in occultism or in theosophy of one kind or another. Thus Protestant works are not purely religious. In Catholicism everything that had any life in it was probably killed off in times of the Inquisition. Catholic works on religious practice, such as the well-known Book of Ignatius Loyola, are nothing but manuals for creating hallucinations of a definite and stereotyped character. Jesus on the cross, the Virgin Mary with the infant, saints, martyrs, hell, heaven and so on. In other words, they teach the transference of dreams into certain definite images. A process quite possible, and called in pseudo-occultism, clairvoyance. The same methods for creating pseudo-clairvoyance exist and play a very important part in modern occultism. A parody of these methods is to be found in Eliphas Levi's book, Dogma and the Rituals of High Magic, where he describes an evocation of the devil in rituals, on page 243. Unfortunately, very few readers of Eliphas Levi understand that this is a parody. Pseudo-clairvoyance, dreams in the waking state, desired and expected hallucinations are called in Orthodox mystic literature, beauty. The word beauty is a translation of the Greek word meaning temptation or seduction. However, the Russian language, aside from its first meaning of allurement, has a great many associations connected with its second meaning, charm or beauty. In an English translation, the word beauty renders best the meaning put into words in the Preparatory and the narrations of a pilgrim. It also clearly shows the character of the experiences preferred in Catholic mysticism and in pseudo-occultism, that is their external and formal beauty as opposed to their inner meaning and content. It is characteristic of Orthodox mysticism that it warns people, and cautions them against precisely what Catholic mysticism and pseudo-occultism advise and suggest. Interesting works on religious practice are to be found in literature of the Eastern Orthodox Church. First, there is a collection of writing, bound in 6 volumes bearing the title, Preparatory, the greater part of which was translated from Greek, that contain descriptions of mystical experiences, statutes and regulations of monastic life. Rules of prayer and contemplation, descriptions of methods very close to Hatha Yoga, and adopted in Bhakti Yoga, as for example methods of breathing, of different postures, positions of the body and so on. Aside from the Preparatory itself, it is worth mentioning a small book belonging to the middle of the 19th century that was sold in Russia in the 3rd edition of 1884. The book is called The Sincere Narrations of a Pilgrim to His Spiritual Father. It is by an unknown author, and is in a sense an introduction to the Preparatory, though at the same time quite an independent treatise on religious practice, very near to Bhakti Yoga. An acquaintance with this small book gives an idea of the character, and of the spirit of Bhakti Yoga. The Narrations of a Pilgrim is interesting from a literary point of view, being one of a number of little-known gems of Russian literature. Both the pilgrim and the people he met and spoke of, are all living Russian types, many of whom have existed up to the present time. It is difficult to tell whether the pilgrim actually existed, and narrations were written down from his words by the Archimandrite Paisi, author of the foreword to the book, or whether these narrations are Paisi's own, or some other educated monk. Much of the narration leads one to suspect the pen and thought not only of an educated, but of a highly educated, and of a highly talented individual. On the other hand, those who know in what an extraordinarily artistic way some Russians such as this pilgrim can tell stories about themselves and everything else, will not think it impossible for the pilgrim to have been a real living person, who was actually speaking about himself. The Narrations of a Pilgrim contains a schematic explanation of the principles of a special exercise of Bhakti Yoga that is called constant or mental prayer, and a description of the result this prayer gives. The pilgrim repeated his prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, at first 3,000 times consecutively in a day, then 6,000 times, then 12,000 times and finally without counting. When the prayer had become quite automatic in him, did not require any effort and was repeated involuntarily, he began to bring it into the heart, that is to make it emotional and to connect a definite feeling with it. After a certain time the prayer began to evoke this feeling and to strengthen it, enriching it to an extraordinary degree of acuteness and intensity. The narrations of a pilgrim cannot serve as a manual for the practical study of mental prayer, because the description of the method of study contains a certain probably intentional incorrectness, namely far too great an ease and rapidity in the pilgrim's study of mental prayer. Nevertheless, the book gives a clear idea of the principles of work upon self, according to the methods of Bhakti Yoga, and is in many respects a unique production of its kind. The methods of the Dobrotalubie have not vanished from real life, as is shown by a description of Mount Athos by B. Zaitsev, which was published in Paris in 1928. B. Zaitsev describes the everyday life and the character of the religious practice in the Russian monastery of St. Panteleimon at Mount Athos. It can be seen from his prayer, that mental prayer, the cell rule, plays a very important part in monastic life. The basis of this life is the cutting off of personal will, and an absolute submission to hierarchic authority. No monk may go out of the gates of the monastery without having received the blessing, permission, from the abbot. The abbot assigns to every monk his obedience, that is, the particular work he has to do. Thus there are monks who are fishermen, woodcutters, kitchen gardeners, agricultural laborers, vineyard workers, sawyers and more intellectual workers. Monk librarians, grammarians, icon painters, photographers and so on. The arrangement of the day in the monastery is fixed once for all and everything moves in obedience with the hands of the clock. But as everything is unusual at Mount Athos, so time also is astonishing. To the day of my departure I could not get used to it. It is the ancient East. At sunset the hand of the tower clock is moved to midnight. The whole system changes according to the time of the year and one must move with the seasons and adapt oneself to the sunset. In May the difference between Mount Athos and European time amounts to about 5 hours. Thus matins in St. Panteleimon's monastery began, while I was there at 6 o'clock in the morning, 1 in the morning by European time. Matins continue until 4 or 4:30 in the morning, European time. After matins there follows immediately, the Mass, liturgy, that continues until 6 in the morning. Thus half the night is spent in church services, which is a characteristic feature of Mount Athos. Then everybody rests until 7. From 7 to 9 is obedience, the work given to each monk by the abbot. For nearly everyone, even the oldest monks come out to work, if they are even relatively in good health. They go to the forest, to vineyards, to kitchen gardens, they load oxen with timber, mules with hay and firewood. The first meal is at 9 o'clock, and then obedience again till 1. At 1 o'clock there is tea and rest until 3, then obedience until 6 o'clock. From 5:30 to 6:30 Vespers are said in the churches. Very few monks attend these day services for most of them are at work, but Vespers are read for them at their work. At 6 in the evening there is the second meal, if it is not a fast day. If it is Monday, Wednesday or Friday, instead of a meal they have only bread and tea. After the second meal the church bells ring for complines, that continue from 7 to 8 o'clock. Then follows cell rule, that is prayer with bowings in the cell. Such as the Jesus prayer, Ave Maria, prayer for the dead, prayer for the living and so on. After each short prayer the monk moves one bead of his rosary and makes a bow from the waist. At the 11th bead, a large one, he bows to the ground. Thus a cassocked monk, the lowest monastic degree, makes daily 600 bows from the waist. A mantled monk makes about 1,000, and a monk invested with schema, about 1,500, not counting corresponding bows to the ground. In the case of a cassocked monk it takes about an hour and a half, in the case of a monk from the highest rank, from 3 to 3.5 hours. Consequently a cassocked monk is free at about 10 o'clock, and the others at about 11. Till 1 o'clock when matins begin, is the monk's sleeping time, 2 to 3 hours. To this is sometimes added an hour in the morning and perhaps an hour in the afternoon after tea. But as every monk has his own small things to do, which take time, it may be supposed that the monks sleep not more than 4 hours each day, maybe less. To laymen who have seen this lifestyle, the essence of which is that the monks pray through the night, work through the day, and have very little sleep and very poor food, it is a mystery how they can stand it. Yet they live and live to a very old age. The majority at the monastic population are obviously very old men. Furthermore, the commonest type of Mount Athos monk seems to be a healthy, calm and balanced person. Monastic life, whatever severity and difficulties it may involve, is certainly not Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti Yoga can be applied to every religion, of course to a real religion and not an invented one, which means that Bhakti Yoga includes all religions and recognizes no difference between them. Bhakti Yoga does not require a final abandonment of life, but only temporary withdrawal, for the attainment of a definite aim. When the aim is attained, the yoga then becomes unnecessary. The yoga requires more initiative and more understanding. Yoga is a more active way. Monastic life is a more passive way. Nevertheless, the study of monastic life and of monastic asceticism is of interest from the psychological point of view, because here many ideas of yoga can be seen in practical application, though possibly in a setting different from true yoga. As well as in orthodox monasteries, the ideas of Bhakti Yoga occupy a very important place in the Mohammedan monasteries of Sufis and dervishes. Also in Buddhist sanghas, particularly Theravada monasteries, such as are found in Sri Lanka, Nepal and Burma, where Buddhism has been preserved in its purest form. Ramon Krishna was both a yogi and a monk at the same time, but more a monk than a yogi. His followers, as far as can be judged by information to be found in literature, have gone partly in a religious, partly in a philosophical direction, although they call it yoga. In reality, the school of Ramon Krishna has not left behind any ways to a practical yoga, having deviated into theoretical descriptions of these ways.